Good evening. I'm Stephen Bartkus, the curator of the Gunn Historical Museum in Washington, Connecticut. Thank you for joining us for Lake Waramaug and the generations of people who made it their own. The first lecture in our series about Lake Waramaug. This presentation is kindly sponsored by our friends at the Lake Waramaug Task Force and the Lake Waramaug Association. This evening, Christine Adams, our distinguished guest, will share her interesting story on the cultural and social history of Lake Waramaug. Jean Solomon, a trustee of the Gunn Memorial Library and Museum, will be introducing her. During this lecture, we ask that you please mute both your audio and video settings. If you have questions, you may submit them throughout the lecture in the chat box, and Christine will answer some of them at the end. Please note that our next guest lecturer is Sean Hayden, who will present how the Lake Waramaug Task Force brought the lake back from the brink. Our second lecture on Lake Waramaug on Monday, May 16th, 2022 at 6:30 p.m. on Zoom. Please mark your calendars and register for this presentation on the Gunn Museum's website. We'd also like to remind you that the Gunn Museum is participating in the annual two-day Give Local Greater Waterbury and Litchfield Hills fundraiser next Tuesday, April 26th, and Wednesday, April 27th. This is our only fundraiser of the year, and we have a goal to raise $16,000 for the museum. Your donation to the Gunn Museum during Give Local will be increased with bonus funds from the Connecticut Community Foundation. So this is the best time of year to show your support. We greatly appreciate your continuing interest in the Gunn Museum and your support of our work to preserve and share the amazing history of Washington, Connecticut. Now, I'd like to hand it over to Jean.
Hello and good evening. My name is Jean Solomon. It is my great pleasure to welcome our guest lecturer, Christine Adams. Christine, whose family has kept a cottage on the lake for 5 generations, serves on the board of directors of the Lake Waramaug Task Force. She previously served on the Lake Waramaug Association Board of Directors for 10 years and edited their biannual newsletter, for which she authored a popular series of articles pertaining to the rich history of the Lake District. Currently, Christine is in the final stages of a book project, A History of a Centuries-Old Cottage in the village of New Preston, and is a researcher for the Gunn Historical Museum. She studied English, history, and creative writing at Gettysburg College and is a certified grant writer and published poet. Thank you, Christine, for your participation here this evening. And now I'll hand this over to you.
Thank you so much, Jean and Stephen, for your kind introductions, and welcome lake lovers. It's a pleasure to see so many familiar names popping up on the screen and the chat box. Thank you. It's a challenge to recount a complete history of such a storied place as Lake Waramaug in a mere 45 minutes. Its natural and indigenous histories warrant their own lectures. So instead, I will focus on representative personal stories from each era. The nature of this place is one we all know intimately. The beautiful environment of rolling hills and crystalline waters is one we have all made our own in a very personal way. Described in a recent interview surrounding a project I am working on regarding the history of the village of New Preston, as Jean mentioned, I interviewed lifelong Washington resident Dmitry Rimsky. He described the natural features of our area as being made up of the DNA of place, an image I loved. That is, the natural features of the landscape that remain relatively unchanged, spanning generations. We will be talking more about the nurturers of place this evening, namely the people who made Lake Waramaug their own. These are the stories that nostalgia are made of. Those who have nurtured the land and the lake, and in some cases arguably not for the better, will be our primary focus. We will begin with the Indigenous people, who are unique in that they have experienced the entire history of our lake firsthand. We will then meet the colonists and those who made the lake a source of power for industry along the East Aspetuck River. The East Aspetuck is the lake's only outlet, where many dams were built, capitalizing on the impressive 300-foot falls and the numerous natural resources available near its banks. We will then move on to the era of lake as resort, a heyday of sorts, a summer community, an artist haven to today. Of course, there are great overlaps in the historic eras of Lake Waramaug. No one group of people can necessarily fit into one category. The farms have existed here throughout history, and industry has merely taken different shape. All have loved and utilized the lake for its recreational qualities, and yet one can recognize significant shifts and tendencies in usage that correspond with the time when the DNA of place and person mesh in the most unique of ways. This is the US Geological Survey of Lake Waramaug and surrounds. One can see from the topography that ours is a natural glacial lake. When the last Ice Age glaciers melted over what is now Connecticut, Lake Waramaug was formed. Geologists hypothesize that at the end of the last glacial period, 10,000 years ago, these enormous ice masses began to retreat, eroding the land and leaving deposits of ice in hollows between drumlins and hills. You can see them here: Tanner Hill, Tinker Hill, Mount Bushnell, the pinnacle, of course, Strawberry Ridge. When these massive areas of ice melted, they left behind lakes. Ours is the second largest natural lake in Connecticut, second only to Bantam. It's made up of 656 acres and 692 feet of surface area. The average depth is 22.1 feet and the maximum is 40. Maximum length and width, 2.4 miles and 1.7 miles respectively. The primary inflow is Sucker Brook, seen here near Willow Point in the northeast, but groundwater also keeps the water high. The only outflow is the East Aspetuck River, just south of Marks Hollow's Point, which you can see also in a detail on the right there. Horace Bushnell moved to New Preston in 1804 with his father Ensign, who bought acreage along the East Aspetuck River to develop a fulling mill and carding shop. It's interesting to note how he described our natural iceborne beauty in strikingly recognizable prose. Quote, "The scenery of New Preston abounds in lovely pictures of which Lake Waramaug is the center. The sheet of crystalline water winds like a river among its hilly shores, which at the southern end rise and peer at their own woody shadows in its still mirror. On the east, the pinnacle rises from the water, its erect figure clothed halfway up with forest, its rocky outline, as seen from the lake, projected against the sky. From its base, the lake turns away westward with a wider sweep, the shore gracefully indented with little coves and crowned with green farms. Rolling hills, Sugarloaf and others fill the western distance, and through their misty valleys and across the water, the setting sun sends the glory of his level beams." And here we are 2 centuries later, and Bushnell's description is still highly recognizable. Horace went on to become nationally recognized and who historians describe as the father of liberal religious thought. He was educated right here in the schools of New Preston and later at Yale University. Mount Bushnell is seen here, just on the south side of Lake Waramaug. It's named for him, of course, as has a park and theater in Hartford. The first people make up the longest serving stewards to Lake Waramaug, spanning over 10,000 years. To give you an idea of perspective, the first colonists arrived here only 278 years ago, and the United States is a relatively young 246. The Paleolithic era brought the first inhabitants to what is now Connecticut, according to various professionals at Washington, Connecticut's Institute for American Indian Studies, which I will refer to henceforth as the IAIS. These people were nomadic and followed migratory animals. There are more than 10 Native American archaeological sites within just 2 miles of Lake Waramaug, according to Lucienne Lavin of the IAIS. I will mention only 3, but extensive pits have already been studied. The overabundance of productive test pits in the area most assuredly confirms that there's much, much more to learn and uncover about Indigenous people, but modern disturbances to the land have made it much more difficult. And this is an aerial photo with the vegetation removed of the Hopkins hayfield on the north shore of Lake Waramaug, where a Dalton Vale fluted point dating to 12,000 years ago was discovered. It was identified just recently in 2012 by Jonathan Lothrop curator at the New York State Museum and one of the leading experts in the Paleolithic era, and found by Craig Nelson, a local historian, and of course, the former first selectman of Warren, and I'm sure he's recognizable to all of you, but he's photographed here just in case. Another interesting note, the black arrow on the slide points to what is now Sucker Brook, but that is not its original location. It was dredged after significant damage was sustained after the catastrophic flood of 1955. In fact, Sucker Brook used to flow in the direction of the red line I have drawn here, and is now known as Potash Brook. This area is the only inflow to Lake Waramaug, although there are also springs and groundwater, which I mentioned before, that contribute to the high water levels. There was also a summer encampment of Native tribes well ensconced on the 40 acres of the Hopkins hillside at an archaeological excavation site that is still active today and known colloquially as Deer Run. Indigenous people continued to frequent these former homelands, fishing and camping on them well into the 19th century. William Hopkins, owner of the Hopkins Vineyard, told archaeologist David Thompson that his grandfather reported Native Americans camping along the lake in that time frame. They shared a groundhog dinner on one occasion, and one of the historic houses along North Shore Road, I believe it's the one being renovated now, contains an interior well, which oral histories report was built because Indians regularly camped in the Hopkins field just east of the house. Water was needed. Another significant archaeological landmark is found on the East Aspetuck River at the site of the former Woodruff Mill, or the Woodruff Rock Shelter. According to the state archaeologist's findings, the cave was large enough to house 40 to 50 people until 1000 BCE, when a massive slab of granite fell from the overhead and blocked most of the entry. Worse, in about 1900, most of the remaining overhang was unknowingly destroyed by Henry Beeman, who was embarking on site work connected to his bass fish hatchery, which you can see being constructed here. Beeman was also a Renaissance man, however, and contributed much to our community. He made world-class violins in this mill and played them beautifully too. He was a botanist and developed a strain of blueberry that grew to the size of plums, a vibrant strain of petunias, and a shagbark hickory tree with succulent nuts. And considering what was lost at the turn of the 20th century, it's curious to know what was found during the summers of 1974 through 1976. Much more would have been lost if it hadn't been for the stewardship of Robert Woodruff, who owned the iconic bread mill on East Shore Road from 1941 until 1989. By benign neglect, he let his land go back to its natural state, but most importantly, he invited archaeologists from the IAIS to conduct 3 summers worth of digs. This partnership was initiated by a local 5th grader named Ted Adams, who's no relation that I know of, and he found fragments of deer and elk bones on the site while playing with friends. He brought them to the Washington Primary School to show his classmate's father, Ned Swigert, who's also the IAIS's founder. The Woodruff Rock Shelter revealed that woodland-era First Peoples, both men and women, lived in our neighborhood year-round based on the variety of osteologic evidence found in the cave. Elk roamed the area, not only revealing the diet of our former neighbors, but providing clues to the ecology of the time. Elk were grazers and competed with white-tailed deer, also found in abundance in the cave. Therefore, we know that there was less deciduous forest in the area and much more grasslands. Incidentally, Robert Woodruff himself was a nostalgic. In 1941, he bought the iconic red mill from Henry Beeman and immediately removed the electric generator. He painstakingly restored the old 50 horsepower turbine and water wheel to operate a sawmill and machine shop in the old-fashioned way. Regardless of the less than state-of-the-art technology, he was also granted a classified World War II US Navy contract to produce an anti-aircraft weapon called the Orlakian, which locals claim was awarded to him because of the sheer size of the old red mill, which could accommodate the 32-foot-long board required for its manufacture. It's remarkable to know, too, that as late as 1991, all the water rights to Lake Waramaug and the East Aspetuck River were attached to Woodruff's privilege. What we know of Chief Waramaug is this. He was an 18th century sachem of an alliance of small local tribes, the Pomperogs of Woodbury, the Bantams of Litchfield, the Scatticokes of Kent, the Weatogs of Salisbury, the Weantanogs of New Milford, and the Putatuks of Newtown. Under his leadership, these tribes banded together for protection from raiding Mohawks and had lookouts on Mount Tom, the Pinnacle, and Fort Hill in what is now New Milford. His primary residence was on the Housatonic River over the Great Falls, pictured here, and what is now known as New Milford again. According to Victorian historian John William DeForest, quote, "He was so considerable a personage as to have reserved as his hunting ground a considerable part of the present society of New Preston, which always until the incorporation of the town of Washington, of which it is part, was called Waramaug, after the original proprietor, dropping for convenience sake the prefix we. Waramaug took his name meaning place of good fishing from the tribal hunting grounds near the Great Falls on the Housatonic River, not Waramaug. The tribe wintered in the area near the current Lake Lilinona. Lake Waramaug, known as Crooked Pond, was simply their summer territory. We know that he had a son named Cheery, but there is no historic reference that he had a daughter named Lilinona. Although local folk stories like to wax poetic about a tragic love she felt for a white man, the tale is suspiciously like hundreds of others told throughout the country, and one Mark Twain wrote about in his Life on the Mississippi. Quote, "There are 50 lover sleeps along the Mississippi from whose summit disappointed Indian girls have jumped." And as Paul Wegman of the IAIS has said, historians in the 19th century wrote out Native Americans, adding, "Lilinona is a princess, a simple Western concept, and seeks redemption in the hands of a white man. The message is that what she's looking for and what Native people need to do is to assimilate." No known likeness of Chief Waramaug exists, although this portrait of the chief might be the most accurate. Chief Waramaug by David Bruce Graves was commissioned by the Gunn Historical Museum for its long-term exhibit on the history of Washington. Graves used artifacts provided by the Gunn Museum and the IAIS for this portrait, but painted the likeness in his own image. Graves is African American. Other scholars think he may have looked like Itau O. Combe, seen here in an engraving by John Verelst, made from a painting by Jean Simon. Itau O. Combe was a Mohican tribesman of the Upper Hudson River Valley in Western Connecticut, who was one of 4 Native American leaders who visited Queen Anne in 1710. It was an audience facilitated by Peter Shuttler, who was a British agent to the monarch and meant to seek an alliance with North American tribes to counter the French presence here. Chief Waramaug lived in a wigwam framed with poles and covered with bark laid out and fastened with sinew. The interior walls were decorated with Aboriginal art and, of course, Indigenous animal skins. And of course, other depictions of Waramaug exist. And this is a poster commemorating the New Milford Bicentennial, which took place between June 15th and 18th, 1907, which features an actor wearing Western tribal dress and is completely inaccurate. Around 1900, John and Sarah Haight Holsworth of Arrow Point commissioned Edward Willing Deming, a nationally known landscape artist who specialized in Indigenous subjects. These are all romanticized imagery of Waramaug based on post-contact information. But these misconceptions are slowly being reconsidered. The leadership at the Lake Waramaug Country Club, for example, recently created a committee to readdress the revisionist ethnohistory by which we have all been misinformed, and adopted a statement that recognizes the land on which it stands is in actuality the ancestral home of many who for millennia came before us. Waramaug was described by the first minister of New Milford Congregational Church, Daniel Boardman, who is pictured on the left here, as discreet and friendly, a distinguished sachem with great abilities and eminent virtues. Boardman also claims to have converted him to Christianity and wrote, quote, "It appears that he professed repentance for his sins and faith in Christ and died a Christian. Yet an account in Samuel Orcutt's history tells of a peculiar scene at Waramaug's deathbed, where both Reverend Boardman and a medicine man summoned by Waramaug's wife were engaged in a dramatic prayer match at great volume. Boardman left detailed accounts of his labors with the sachem, which have been lost, sadly, although some details of his journals were included in a later sermon given by a later minister of the First Congregational Church, Stanley Griswold. And for fun, I've included a portrait of Daniel's son, Elijah, painted by Ralph Earl in 1789, and is currently on display at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. He was a successful merchant in both New Milford and New Preston. He had a shop here in New Preston as well. That's new information. According to DeForest, on Falls Mountain, where it rises gradually toward the northeast, at a distance of about 80 rods from the gorge, is located Waramaug's monument, a rude pile of small field stones with a single stone standing upright at the top, all of it nearly 6 feet in height. He having requested, as it is said, to be buried here, that he might look abroad upon the beautiful country of his people and not feel lonely in the future life to which he was going. It is said that the Indians had a custom that whenever they passed this monument, they brought a small stone and threw it down at the base of the pile in honor of the departed chief. And hence, scattered about within 3 feet of it are a bushel, perhaps, of such stones, indicating by the small amount that not many years after his burial, his brethren ceased to pass that way, having removed to a distance, and that his white brethren have scarcely disturbed a stone of that monumental pile. His burying place has become an elusive holy grail of sorts for many amateur historians. According to the New York Times contributor and local resident as well, Blake Levitt, the property on which the monument stood was bought by the Herds of Bridgeport in 1880, who allegedly used the monument stones as part of the foundation for houses built on the site. The property was deeded to the state in 1973 and now is Lover's Leap State Park. In the mid-1980s, an employee of the Inn on Lake Waramaug found a pile of stones with 4 to 5 foot obelisk lying on its side nearby. David Porter, the state archaeologist at the time, was unwilling to confirm the discovery, but did say that it appears that he might be on the right track. According to anthropologist and historian Franz Wachowski, Waramaug died in 1722. This date has been erroneously listed as 1735 since the aforementioned John William DeForest published his History of the Indians of Connecticut. Most subsequent authors, those focused less on prehistoric pursuits, have maintained that incorrect date. But we know from Daniel Boardman himself, from a letter dated November 7th, 1722, outlining the dramatic scene from Waramaug's deathbed and alleged conversion. This letter used to be housed in the archives at the Smithsonian Institution, which I have tried to obtain. It has since been refiled with the Boardman papers at Yale, which remains closed to outsiders due to current pandemic restrictions, but I'm working on it. The point is, the dates suspiciously coincide with the dates inscribed on land deeds between Waramaug and colonial settlers, a topic that seems to also coincide with the national story of questionable land transactions between Native people and colonial settlers. According to the Gunn Museum, as white settlers moved into the area, they were welcomed by the natives as a strong defense against the Mohawks. They willingly sold land to these settlers with little understanding that English ideas of land ownership were entirely different from their own. The colonial government granted the land north of Woodbury and west of the Housatonic River to the towns of Windsor and Hartford in 1686. The tribe was granted a reserve in the area, which was called naturally Waramaug's Reserve, where they were allowed lifetime use of the land for hunting, fishing, fowling, and planting. It is within the reserve that the Cogswell and Averill families bought 500 acres, which proved to be the most valuable. Early surveyors of the lot discovered a very healthy vein of iron ore here, making their compasses spin. The power of the river, the size of the pond, and the neighboring woodlands on Mount Bushnell made it the perfect setting for the industrial powerhouse that New Preston was about to become. The marble found nearby was simple, profitable icing on the cake. And I would be remiss to omit the dramatic arrival of the Cogswell family in 1635. John Cogswell, whose great-grandson Edward would establish New Preston 100 years later with others, arrived on one of the many great ships of the Great Migration, the Angel Gabriel. The boat once belonged to Sir Walter Raleigh, the very same ship he used on his last voyage to Guyana in 1617, just to give you an idea of the daisy chain of events that is human history. Thanks to the extensive journals of Richard Mather, father to Increase and grandfather to Cotton, and also known as a big-time Puritan, we know a lot about that fated voyage, which ended in a shipwreck off the coast of Pemaquid Bay, Maine on August 25th, 1635. The great colonial hurricane hit violently and unexpectedly. On board was John Francis Cogswell, naturally his wife, 8 of his 9 children and his servants. They were swept from the deck and washed ashore, losing 5,000 pounds worth of property. And according to Ancestry.com, 2 of his daughters lost their lives that day. And somehow this trunk on the right, now on view at Colonial Pemaquid State Historic Site in New Harbor, Maine, survives. Edward would arrive in New Preston 2 generations later, and along with Daniel Averill, purchased 500 acres in Waramaug's Reserve, as said, and immediately established the Cogswell Ironworks. This site would later host Oscar Beeman's mill, which would later pass to his son Henry and then to Robert Woodruff, to whom I've already introduced you. Daniel Averill had the first mill privilege on the East Aspetuck and built a grist mill. And in less than 75 subsequent years, 21 mills would be operational on the East Aspetuck, with New Preston known as Upper City and Marbledale as Lower City. Early land deeds of Washington and New Preston referred to Lake Waramaug simply as West Pond. Paul Graney, the state historian who performed the Historic and Architectural Resource Survey of Washington, Connecticut in 2000, reports Lake Waramaug served merely as a large holding pond for these 21 water-powered industries. Among them were an ironworks, grist and sawmills, distilleries of various kinds, factories for stone cutting and woodworking, the manufacture of tools, furniture, cotton clothes, linens, and grain sacks. It was the perfect locale for industry, as the East Aspetuck drops an impressive 300 feet at the falls. Nearly all the early 19th century forges and furnaces that had flourished in the area were linked closely with a local economy that was largely agricultural in character. Iron makers in these localities were engaged primarily in providing pots, stoves, horseshoes, nails, etc., for the use of the community in which they resided. Their raw materials came from the veins of iron ore, and final products seldom were sold beyond the boundaries of the town. The lake itself housed indigenous settlements, farms, and little else. And photographed here, top left, is Edwin Beardsley's tannery, which was raised in the late 1970s. And in the top row middle, interestingly, is the Smith and Burnham twine factory. And it's the only photo that I know that exists of the place. And it was also formerly Ensign Bushnell's fulling mill and part of Daniel Averill's original privilege. Locals tell me that it was abandoned during the 1920s and made a convenient hiding place for a still during Prohibition as well. On the lower left is a former sawmill, which we've just learned was built by Christopher and Elisha Allen in 1823. And then it burned in 1980 under suspicious circumstances. At the time, it belonged to a local artist named Charlie Gross, who I'm learning was a very controversial character. In the middle, bottom row, is one of the original Cogswell mills, which was torn down in the 1990s when it belonged to Joe Young. He ran a cafe here called The Shed. Maybe some of you remember it. And the 2 on the right is another of Cogswell's original mills, likely a cider mill. And if the site of Cogswell Ironworks and later Beeman and Woodruff's mill are ground zero for the industrial history of Waramaug, well, Hopkins Farm is certainly ground zero for its agricultural one. As we already know, there are numerous prehistoric sites on Hopkins land. During the colonial days, just west of the Hopkins Farm, the first house on Lake Waramaug was likely built, according to Mary Harwood's history. Stephen Payne from Canterbury, Connecticut built it, and here is where the first white child was born in September of 1738. Revolutionary War veteran Elijah Hopkins bought the land in 1787, a transaction that's steeped in local folklore. Alas, it was not purchased from a local tribesman with a string of fish fastened to his torso, but of Mason Cogswell of Warren. Immediately, he established the family farm, which has been in continuous operation since then. Here, they've cultivated tobacco, raised cattle, and now grapes here. Today, the Hopkins Vineyard is nationally recognized as a heritage farm cultivated for 7 generations in more than 235 years. And I recommend going to their website and watching their About Us page. On it, there's a video directed and produced by a member of the youngest generation, Paloma Criollo. It invokes the feeling of connection. Like the Hopkins family is the tie that binds us all together in our shared history. And aside from the state park and town beaches, it's the one place where the lake can still be enjoyed by anyone. William Hopkins began to take boarders in 1846. The following year, he replaced Elijah's house with the imposing, iconic cupola building on the North Shore with which we're all familiar. And a school was established just to the west of the property in 1788, first known as the Pond School and later as the Lake School, naturally, and a structure that still exists, now renovated and housing a family. And this is a photograph taken of New Preston Village sometime between 1870 and 1880 from the perspective of East Shore Road or Route 45. It might be confusing because where that wagon is in the foreground is the present site of Pavilion Hall. So I will say the taking in of boarders by Hopkins marks an important shift to the generation of warmongers who were to follow. The industries along the East Aspetuck inevitably fail due to national factors beyond local control, but the DNA of place that is so aesthetically pleasing allows for the lake to reinvent itself. Cotton, due to lack of importation from southern states, was hard to come by, and the Smith and Burnham cotton twine factory suffered and shuttered. Daniel Burnham then built the store photographed here, which is now home to Privet House Antiques. The inventory of the late 19th century was altogether similar to what is sold there today, but with an additional practical inventory like books, periodicals, and local produce. After the Civil War, steam power was used much more than hydro. Cities became more of a draw, and incidentally, a few centuries later, metro areas continued to be appealing for returning GIs, hurting local farming. Frederick Gunn, an educator on the Green in Washington, also felt the effects of the Civil War. Gunn had founded his school in the idea that it be inclusive of girls, African Americans, Native Americans, and international students. He was a staunch abolitionist that suffered social ostracism for his beliefs, which at the time clashed with those of the Congregational Church. Remember, at the time, they were really holding fast to that theory of predestination. When the political climate inevitably changed, he became a moral beacon for the community and an educational innovator in curriculum, which indirectly included sport and outdoor activities as part of his pedagogy. In 1851, he led his students 40 miles from Washington to Welch Point in Milford, Connecticut, where they camped, fished, cooked over the fire, and practiced military drills, in part to prepare them for service in the Civil War. After the war, and due to the wild popularity of these trips, Gunn organized a summer semester on Lake Waramaug at Point Beautiful on the West Shore. It's photographed here. It's a very rare photograph. He invited alumni, parents, as well as students to participate, which included boating and swimming. These camps continued from 1867 to 1879, just 2 years before Gunn's death, and he's now recognized by the American Camp Association as the founder of leisure camping. There were significant transportation changes too, which was both a cause and effect of cities becoming the epicenter for manufacture and lucrative business. The arrival of 3 different rail lines to Litchfield County had a surprising effect on the industry economy here. The roads that existed in colonial times contributed to the rise of manufacturing, but these toll roads were less traveled after the train. Charters on many of the area's turnpikes, including New Preston and Warren, were eventually revoked due to unrepaired damage. The population of Litchfield County dropped 20% between 1850 and 1920. Industries slowly shuttered, later to be repurposed as stores, catering to a vacationing crowd and the locals that remained. Very quickly, Lake Waramaug became less of a source of power to the local mills and more of a recreational resource. And you can see 17 Inns here became the local economic powerhouse. In 1874, the New Preston reporter for the Litchfield Inquirer and Newtown Bee, Myron Cable, reported, with his tongue firmly in his cheek, that the times are lively here. Boarders are almost as numerous as flies. They prowl the forest, clamber up the mountains, follow the little streams for trout. Every nook and cranny among those is being explored by health and pleasure seekers. 2 or 3 times a day, they congregate at the post office, and we green country gawkies stand staring, studying their style, watching them twirl their canes, and wishing we were New Yorkers with such fine manners and fine clothes. In 1880, he writes that 300 to 400 people were summering on Lake Waramaug. In the early days of their operation, most, if not all, of the inns on Lake Waramaug had a policy of restricted patronage. That is, people of color or Jewish heritage were not welcomed in their establishments. Correspondence found in the Gunn archives, as well as notations on postcards and advertisements, corroborate this sad truth. Visitors traveled by train from New York to Lake Waramaug. The New Preston station on Beebrook Road received travelers, and a livery service like Kenny and Hosford, which was located at the former Pickett Farm in New Preston Village, would transport guests from the station to the inn of their choice. They would travel to the shore via Flirtation Avenue, which locals say got its name for providing a private moment or two for an embrace in their horse-drawn covered wagons. It was not at all unusual for New Yorkers to stay an entire summer. The Newtown Bee and their social pages would routinely report the many moves by locals in the spring and the desolation of September, when homes would be boarded up for the winter and left with leaves piled high along the foundation for insulation purposes. The steamboat Flirt offered tours on the lake with pickups and drop-offs at several locations, including the inns. Water and lawn sports, evening dances, and dinners of local fish, in particular eel, were offered. And in 1897, the Pavilion Club, which hosted spectacles, concerts, vaudeville shows, and plays, built their hall in the village of New Preston. We know from newspaper articles that those spectacles included minstrel shows, but more noble pursuits were afoot at the pavilion, including a fundraiser entitled The Farmerettes, the proceeds of which supported families suffering economically while their breadwinners were abroad fighting in the First World War. The Lakeview Inn, later known as the Inn on Lake Waramaug, opened in the 1870s. William Henry Bonig of New Jersey had been a guest at Sheldon's Cottage for previous years, as well as at Benjamin Norris's Lakeview Farm, where he let rooms. In 1898, when Norris ran into financial difficulties, he sold it to the Bonig family, who had loved the property so well. They renamed Norris Boarding House to the Lakeview Inn, but also kept a farm of pigs, chicken, and dairy cows. They ran the inn for 3 generations, which had become a mainstay for both holiday goers and locals alike. William's son Richard was well known for his year-round community building events, which included horse carriage rallies, clam bakes, huckleberry fin raft races, frog jumping contests, farmers market, witches spelling bees, pumpkin carving, antique car rallies, a turkey Olympics, bell choir, and a surprisingly highbrow chart topper, a New Year's Eve dance accompanied by a 3-piece orchestra. It is Richard who organized the association of the 8 friendly inns around the lake and had local artist Ed Ash design this logo. Richard was beloved by the community, certainly. But animal rights activists didn't love the Turkey Olympics, by the way. In 1996, local protesters organized a demonstration by chaining themselves to a Buick that they called Tofu Tom Turkey. Within 2 years, the event was permanently canceled. Another example of truth being wildly stranger than fiction. Built by John Carter on Cherry Point in 1884, and around the corner from the first hotel of that name was Carter House. Both were celebrated for their fish dinners and entertainment and comfort offered the pleasure-bent guests. Today, it's a private home, greatly reduced in size, with the porches removed. You may recognize it. And according to Myron Cable, newspaper columnist, the Waramaug Inn was built by Thomas Bray in 1901. He died in 1906, at which time it was bought by Augustus Meade, who lived in an adjacent house. It likely only operated as an inn for 3 years and still stands also as a private residence. The Tinker Hill Inn was formerly a private home owned by Vernon and George Staub. It was sold in 1913 to Minnie Emmons. Her husband renovated the home in order to accommodate guests, and the work crew lived on site in a makeshift camp during construction. She sold it in the 1920s, after which it changed hands many times. In December of 1994, a new owner undertook many extensive repairs and renovations to the inn and kept the penultimate name, the Birches. It has recently been torn down to make way for a new, expansive private residence. On this one, my daughter says earns me a PG-13 rating, but I'm going to say it anyway. Cedar Cabin was located at the present site of the Washington Town Beach. In 1924, William McKay of Bristol, Connecticut, bought the property, which had been abandoned and vandalized. He built several rental cottages and a barn for his horses on the existing foundations. A newspaper article in the Herald described the Cedar Cabin as a ruckus speakeasy in what was then, quote unquote, lawless New Preston. As there was no town constable assigned to our small village, it earned that title. Several stills within easy distance to the cabin kept the refreshments flowing at a time in Waramaug's history when the temperance movement created a heated political climate for those enjoying the lake in polar opposing ways. Locals claim that organized crime found a profitable market for their illegal swill here, and that McKay rented out the rental cottages by the hour. The 1920s roared quite loudly at the foot of the lake. McKay later leased the property to Jack Nelson of New York, at which time it became known as Nelson's Landing, with a more wholesome reputation. It burned down in 1930, rebuilt as the Lakeside Pavilion, changed hands several more times, and burned down again in September of 1963. We're sensing a theme here. Fires were very commonplace then. The Lumarwick was built in the 1870s by Bridgeport financiers Loomis, Marsh, and Bostwick, from which the hotel gets its name. It was enlarged in 1882 to accommodate 100 guests. The largest inn on the lake, the Lumarwick offered a variety of activities: boating, tennis, dining, and dancing. The last owner was Thomas Quinlan, who demolished the main inn in 1967 and built himself a private home. The Lakeside Pavilion also burned in the 1970s and was replaced with a box-like structure, which was later renovated into a beautiful vernacular cottage. Incidentally, the Allen and Talmadge families of West Shore Road began making Waramaug their own at the Lumarwick, where their ancestors vacationed in the 1910s. 7 generations later, they still spend their summers on the West Shore and just restored one of their beautiful homes in 2018. The Casino was a popular nightclub from 1930 until 1981. They had rooms for guests, but had been described by some locals as eventually degrading into a glorified flophouse. Parts of the ghoulish horror film Friday the 13th were shot here, and it also burned in the early 1980s. It was bought by a group of concerned citizens to prevent a condominium development with a multi-slip boat mooring, a non-conforming use according to the town of Washington zoning laws. The group sold the property with the intent that it be developed into a single family residence, which it has. And the Lake Waramaug Task Force also maintains a model buffer planting here, intended to catch and absorb harmful stormwater and prevent erosion. As the inns were built, there was a concurrent rapid development of summer residences. Granville Brennig's stately 8-acre summer estate on the West Shore is a good example, and one for which I just happened to perform the title search. Brennig was a New Milford businessman and patent holder who specialized in wood finishing, paints, stains, and the like. He enjoyed entertaining many guests at his home and even held a performance of A Midsummer Night's Dream on those expansive lawns one summer. After his untimely death in 1906, his widow Adeline rented out their boathouse to the Waramaug Yacht Club, as did F.A. Mason further down West Shore Road for more social gatherings, dinners, dances, and the like. It also happens to be my family's summer cottage, where we have enjoyed the last 70 summers. The Yacht Club merged with the Waramaug Golf Club to form the Lake Waramaug Country Club in 1916. Adeline sold the estate in 1909, after which it was held by various New Yorkers who apparently continued to lend the property to the club, including Christian Edward Railing and Lulu Vass, the manager of the Plaza Hotel in New York City, and his show business wife. Like so many others, they went belly up in the 1920s when a Brooklynite named Carl Schumann bought it at a startlingly low number at auction. He expanded the boathouse as a hideaway for his lady love, according to Mary Harwood. And evidence of their illicit affair was found in the rafters when my parents replaced the roof in the 1990s, including bootleg liquor bottles and X-rated letters from a woman named Gertie. My family speculates that the booze must have come from Cedar Cabin, one in an incognito cologne bottle. And in 1948, Michael Wolfe bought the property, just the northern portion of the premises, from a subsequent owner, separating the cottage from the original Brennig estate. It was Wolfe from whom my grandparents bought it in the 1950s, after already having spent many summers on the West Shore. My great-grandfather, H.H. Taylor, had another cottage near Challen Lodge. He was a popular contractor in the area, employed as a foreman for T. Soul and Company, and built many summer homes along the shores of Waramaug, including one for the Hopkins family and another for the Bishop family near the Lumarwick. The Bishop House would later become the child summer home of Janet Bates, one of the founders of the Lake Waramaug Task Force. But also recent research has confirmed that the Bishop House as one of particular architectural pedigree, and that Eric Rossiter designed it. Here I include a couple of images from the newly formed Lake Waramaug Country Club. The photo on the left is of Joan Larned's mother and aunts, another Waramaug family with very, very deep roots. And on the right, a vintage golf game on Golf Links Road. I have to point out too that the precursor to the Cedar Cabin is seen here in the background, that big barn. With the summer population explosion on the lake, the infrastructure needed improvements. In the 1920s, finally, the lake route circumnavigating the lake was completed, causing a bit of a kerfuffle over rights of way with landowners, as I'm sure you can imagine. The Lake Waramaug Association was formed around this time, initially to address the inadequate sewage systems and garbage collection. In early meeting minutes of the association, one can read that many of the concerns of first president Nelson Mead are persistent: road conditions, parking, noisy motorboats, the level of the lake water, mail delivery, and yes, fire safety. As the vacationing crowd began to dwindle with more accessible plane and automobile travel, real estate prices grew more affordable. Artists discovered the area in the wake of World War II, and eventually a sizable creative community developed in Litchfield County. The Washington Art Association was formed, and a creative yet sophisticated air wafted over the waters of Waramaug. According to Jed Pearl's Calder, The Conquest of Space, the later years, Alexander Calder even performed his circus on Lake Waramaug during the 1950s. And during the Second World War, André Masson and his family fled Europe after Germany invaded France and sought refuge on Flirtation Avenue, right here on the banks of Waramaug. He entertained notables like Marc Chagall, he's the one who painted the ceilings of the Paris Opera House, and was inspired by the peaceful setting and stable lifestyle of New Preston. The charcoal drawing here by Masson is undoubtedly New Preston Falls. Those long associated with the Hopkins Inn and Vineyard report that renowned artist Eric Sloan was the first to fund a 4th of July spectacle for lake residents and their guests from the vantage of the inn during the 1960s. He lit flares and fireworks there and was also instrumental to the passage of a 1963 congressional resolution that called for the simultaneous ringing of bells nationwide on Independence Day, a practice that endures at the Warren Congregational Church. He's best known for his brilliantly realistic yet sentimental landscape paintings, heavily influenced by New England folk culture. He was an avid collector of antique farm and woodworking tools, and he lived in the area from 1956 until 1985, a resident of both Warren and, this is new information, Clark Road in Washington. Sloan is buried in Kent on site of the eponymous Eric Sloan Museum and Kent Iron Furnace. According to Bart Barlow of the New York Times, he found the older houses of Warren far north enough because there are older houses here than there are in Vermont. There's more Vermont in Connecticut than he had ever hoped for. Yet he cautioned against mindless nostalgia, using an analogy to explain. It's like going to the town dump and not coming home with the garbage just because it's old, but seeking out things that have been thrown away that shouldn't have been thrown away. And it's clear that Sloan was a preservationist. By asking us to see and feel life as it was lived then, Sloan forces us to understand how we are living now. He found a way to convey that message right here on Waramaug. For 3 years, he had been seeking a setting that would transmit the melancholy mood of an old-time summer home boarded up for the season. One day, en route to his farm, he saw it. He stopped to look, and simultaneously, a tree fell, regardless of the air being completely still. He said, if this isn't the answer, nothing else is. I went home and I did that painting in an hour and a half. It only took me 3 years and an hour and a half. It is reportedly the painting that is contemporary Andrew Wyeth loved the best. And for those of us who remember a Waramaug as a seasonal community, it reminds us of how special and ephemeral a Waramaug summer was. Now, newer, more modern, stately homes rim the lake. During the COVID pandemic, these homes were year-round bunkers for residents seeking safe haven from the city, which was brutally hit by the virus. And as we move forward, we wonder how this generation of lake lovers will define a new era when those fortunate enough to have a home here are also in possession of a flexible work schedule. What is very clear, its current stewards love it no less. They have chosen this storied place to be their own and have used it in a way that will likely be tied to post-pandemic realities. One might assume that there will be more year-round activity here and local businesses will reflect that presence. The area land trusts are used more and the lake has happily held more boats and swimmers. The state park, clubs, and town beaches are full on hot days, and there's a revival in the desire to come together around our crown jewel after close to 2 years of quasi-quarantine. It's exciting to think where the lake might lead us and how the double helix of nature and nurture will continue to intertwine. And for those of us who have summered here for generations, it's also exciting to welcome a new generation of people making the lake their own in innovative ways, but it's also heartwarming to recognize the traditions that have endured, like bagpipers and flares on the 4th of July. Or the spring crew races. And incidentally, rowing has had a long past on Waramaug as any. The Wiantanog people, of course, wielded oars for their canoes. The Oars Club of Bridgeport also held their regatta from Cherry Point from 1875, and the Frederick Gunn School, formerly known as the Gunnery, has hosted its Founders Day Regatta on Waramaug since the 1950s. All generations of people who have made Lake Waramaug their own, Indigenous people, colonists, millers, farmers, shop owners, innkeepers, holiday goers, weekenders, and stewards, all represent a microcosm of the larger American story, but with a gemstone for a setting. With a beauty like Lake Waramaug as the protagonist to our own, we are very fortunate for many reasons, not the least of which are emotional, environmental, and yes, economic. The DNA of this place has interlaced with our own. And although each generation has nurtured the lake very differently for more than 10,000 years, its beauty and power to inspire and connect us are constant. Through interviews I've conducted over more than a decade, that's my biggest takeaway. The nostalgic connection is ours to carry as we travel the greater world. And to paraphrase Ernest Hemingway, of course, if you're lucky enough to have lived on Waramaug, then wherever you go for the rest of your life, it stays with you like a movable feast. Many, many thanks to the Gunn Historical Museum for inviting me to speak this evening. And thank you also to the Association and Task Force for their very generous support. I've enjoyed bringing us together as a community around this movable feast we have all made our own.
Thank you, Christine. This has just been fantastic. I mean, what a journey, what a fascinating story. It's a much layered story, and each layer was just interesting, and you made it so.
Thank you.
So maybe we have a few questions here. Who owns the water rights to Lake Waramaug today?
Oh, that's the jurisdiction of the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. But there's an interesting story surrounding the dam at the mouth of the river at the East Aspetuck. As I mentioned earlier, until 1991, it belonged to Robert Woodruff. And when he died, there was another group of concerned citizens that sold it to a private owner and gifted the dam itself to the town of Washington, who's now responsible for its upkeep and monitored by the task force.
Thank you. Here's another question. Were there any mills on Sucker Brook? And Sucker Brook was the northernmost
Yes, Warren.
brook that fed the lake.
Yes, there was the Clover Mill on Sucker Brook, and it was built, I think, in 1743, but I'm not sure what it was used for. I'd have to look that up, but there certainly was on Sucker Brook, but it didn't have the power of the water that the East Aspetuck have. The East Aspetuck was really quite special because of its sheer power.
Could you please help us distinguish the Lake Waramaug Task Force and the Lake Waramaug Association? Because
Yes.
we've mentioned both of them this evening.
Yes. Well, I used to say the Lake Waramaug Association offers, you know, an ounce of prevention, and the task force offers a pound of the cure. Essentially, you know, the Lake Waramaug Association is the older of the two organizations, and their primary focus is safety issues and land use issues, which is important to prevent the pollution of the water and further degradation of the water. But the task force was formed in the 1970s, also by a group of concerned citizens, mainly to counter-effect the eutrophication of the lake, which was in advanced stages. Anybody who's lived here in the 70s and 80s remembered it was pea soup green. There was so much phosphorus being used in the lakeside. Some of the septic systems were failing. Erosion was an issue. The lake was literally dying in the 70s, and the task force turned it around. Sean will talk much more about that next week, but it's an extraordinary story in its own right.
Okay. We have so many compliments that have been coming in on the chat room, and we share those with you, but just beautiful messages, job well done, just extraordinary story. And yeah, so it's going to be available on YouTube. We will have a copy, and so people can see it again, share it with their friends, and you know, it's just great. So
I also left my email. If somebody has a question, I'm happy to take a question on email. I know we're limited on time.
Yeah, actually, there was one question about where is Point Beautiful?
Point Beautiful, we think, was just east of what was then the Birches Inn. And we think that it might be in the vicinity of the Thorn Cottage, if anyone knows it. It's one of the older cottages on the lake on the west shore that's red. I'm pretty certain that's the point where it was. Have to study that photograph a little bit more. It's a very rare photograph, a beautiful photograph that comes from the gun.
Okay, thank you. So this has just been absolutely fascinating, and you're tracing, you know, the history of Lake Waramaug's generations from way back when, from the nomadics people through the present time is just, it's a pleasure. It's really a joy and a pleasure to hear. So again, I'd like to give special thanks to our sponsors for the lecture, the Lake Waramaug Association and the Lake Waramaug Task Force. And I'm going to just echo Stephen's comments about the Gun Museum participating in Give Local. And please keep us in mind when you are participating in Give Local. And any gift of any size would be very much appreciated. So thank you all in the audience for your participation, attendance this evening, and please enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you again.
Good night.